If you haven't been paying attention, Intel as a company has been struggling lately. They're even considering dropping off of the leading node race, where they've already confirmed that if they don't get a major customer for their 14A process, they're going to end up abandoning it. And while that has some significant ramifications for the entirety of the computer industry, Intel as a company does have multiple products. They still have their CPU division, and they still, as of right now, still have their GPU division. And I think right now is a good time to test out the B580 to see where it stands 6 months after its launch. Now, the graphics landscape has changed dramatically since then. We've had the launch of AMD's 9000 series, and more importantly, we've had the launch of NVIDIA's 5000 series. And I say that NVIDIA is the most important one here because that's the one that the vast majority of people are even buying. And that has dramatically shifted the relevancy of this GPU. But what I want to know is the experience with this GPU good for the people that already bought it? It was a pretty rough launch when it first started because of the fact that Intel still continued to have issues with their drivers. But what I want to see is what the performance would be like if we played some of the most popular and most played games on Steam, because realistically speaking, those are the titles that are the most important. So you can see on the screen right here the games that I am looking at. These were the top most played games on Steam for the day that I was doing this testing. The rankings tend to shift around a bit on a day-to-day basis, but for the most part, these games are always in the most played games, and by a significant margin. Of course, I'm going to throw in a few games in there that aren't on Steam but are still extremely popular because I don't plan on testing all of the games on this list. Just a good majority and the most popular ones. So we're going to look at how it performs, and then we're going to take a look at where exactly it even lands on the market in mid-2025 going towards the end of the year. Because as I said, the graphics market has really changed a lot. But let's look at the performance numbers. So obviously we're going to start off with the most popular game on Steam being Counter-Strike 2. Now, this is not a title that I normally play, but I do know that Counter-Strike 2, the update that took it from Global Offensive to Counter-Strike 2, did come with some graphical improvements, and as a result, it also became more demanding. And what I have noticed in my testing is that the 1% lows seem to still consistently struggle. It's not exactly a fantastic result, but the FPS average is really, really good. And keep in mind that this is also paired with a Ryzen 9 7945HX, so a very decent processor. It clocks all the way up to 5.4 gigahertz. It's really not holding this thing back at all. But the result that we get here with the high graphics settings, this is what the game defaulted to, which I think is perfectly fine. I know a lot of people out there don't even change their graphics settings when they play games, so the fact that the default result is pretty decent here is not too bad. Again, those 1% lows aren't exactly ideal, but this is something that I've observed consistently happening with this game. You can see the little frame time spikes that are happening there. That's something that I have always experienced since the CS2 update. And it is something that is kind of inconsistent. Sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. It can be pretty map specific, but this time around, this was one of the more brutal results that I got from it, and it didn't necessarily take away from the experience. Unless you're some kind of god gamer in this game, you're not exactly going to run into too many issues. But moving on to the second most popular game on Steam, that being PUBG. Yeah, this title has really had some legs to it. Of course, it's way past its peak where it used to be the most played game on Steam, having more than 1 million concurrent players a day, but it's still up there as one of the most played games. And at this point, with a wide assortment of different maps, it can have some pretty inconsistent results. This was the most demanding map that I ended up playing on. I did play 3 different matches. All of them ended up being different maps, but this one was the one that gave me the worst result, and it was still a very, very playable experience. If you're someone that's used to a high FPS gaming experience, this isn't exactly going to give you that, but it was still a very decent result. And you could expect better in some of the different maps. But in a worst case scenario, this is still a pretty great result. And this is, of course, at the ultra graphics settings. Now, I'm just going to jump around a little bit, and we're going to test out Marvel Rivals. This is a title that I've been playing a ton of, so I'm very familiar with how it performs. It being an Unreal 5 engine game, it can be surprisingly demanding considering the art style that it has. But luckily enough, it was a pretty playable experience here with its default graphics settings that ended up being at medium, and it does have the global illumination settings enabled, and it does also have lumen enabled. While it's not the highest FPS gaming experience, and realistically, if I was going to be playing this myself, I would more than likely mess around with the XeSS graphics settings more. It currently being set to quality gives a decent enough result, but I would realistically probably go down to balanced or even performance. This is still going to be a very playable experience, and it does mean that for the people that never mess with graphics settings, they're not going to have a bad time. Now, I understand that probably is not you if you're watching this video, but for your normie cousin, this is pretty good. That means that if they put together a computer with this graphics card, they are going to have a good time without really having to worry too much. Now, Rainbow Six Siege ended up getting an update that changed it over to Rainbow Six Siege X. This update came with some changes to gameplay, but also graphical changes, and as a result, there is going to be some impact to the performance. But as you can see, at 1440p with the ultra graphics settings, I am using the FSR upscaling at quality. This is FSR 2.0, but the result here is pretty decent. Again, not a high refresh rate gaming experience, but still pretty decent, and especially with the 1% lows, and those frame time charts are looking really nice. I did use the built-in benchmark. I just don't play this game at all, and I didn't really want to have to suffer through the multiplayer if I could avoid it, but the result here was pretty great. Now, I did also test out Delta Force, which is a relatively new title. I've never heard of this, but it was high up there in the Steam rankings. And I can kind of understand why. It's essentially a Battlefield game, more akin to Battlefield 2042, but it is free to play. Now, I did see that on Steam it had mixed reviews, so no idea what exactly is happening there, but that does not seem to have dissuaded people from playing it, considering it's still one of the most popular games on Steam. And while visually I don't think it looks as good as the Battlefield games, it's still visually pretty impressive, and it runs really well. The 1% lows are great, the FPS average is great. Again, we are at 1440p, and this is at the max graphics settings. The game also does support XeSS, and I'm using that at the quality setting, and overall the results were pretty great. I didn't really run into any issues with it. I thought it looked perfectly fine, and it's a great result overall, so a very playable experience. I did also try out Naraka Bladepoint. This is actually one of those games that surprised me with how popular it is. Not necessarily because I think it's a bad game. In fact, I quite enjoyed it a bit when it first launched, though I think it was a paid game. I could be misremembering it, but I remember this having a price to it. But it does appear to be free to play now. And running this with the highest in-game graphics settings, it's performing really well. And of course, we are using XeSS, and that is at the quality preset. I'm actually pretty surprised by the amount of titles that support XeSS. The more I've been messing around with this graphics card, the more I'm realizing there's quite a few titles that already have it implemented. So it's good to see that on that front, Intel has been able to get some pretty great momentum. Of course, there are still some major titles that don't support it directly yet, but again, a lot of the most popular titles in the world do support it, and that's really nice to see, because again, those Steam charts don't lie. The vast majority of people out there are playing these really popular titles to the point where the numbers are drastically in favor of titles like this. You might never have even heard of this title, but there are more people playing it than the vast majority of games that are available on Steam right now. So the fact that Intel has been able to deliver in terms of support on titles like this is just great for consumers of the B series in general. Of course, there's a lot of titles on that list, and I don't really want to sit there and play through a lot of those. I don't really like playing Dead by Daylight. I really don't like playing Apex. So I decided, okay, I'm going to hop over to the Epic Games Store and play about the only game worth taking a look at on there, that being Fortnite. This is it running with its default graphics settings, which seem to be a selection of high graphics settings. And we are using upscaling, but it is the TSR upscaling that is built into the Unreal Engine, and this is with a base resolution of 60%. That's again what the game defaulted to, and really I can't complain too much, though the FPS average that we're looking at here is around 60 FPS. The 1% lows are decent enough. Realistically, if I'm playing this myself, I'm going to mess around with the graphics settings to bump up that FPS average and those 1% lows. But if you're one of those people that does not change anything about your graphics settings, you don't really need to worry about this being in an unplayable range. Fortnite is one of those titles that when you launch it, it asks you if you want to optimize the graphics for your hardware, and I've found that for the most part, it does do a good job of reaching that 60 FPS mark that a lot of people are more than comfortable with not even thinking about. You know, they don't think, oh, I need to raise my FPS more. This is the sweet spot for the vast majority of consumers out there. Now, if you're a gamer out there, you have the headroom to really adjust your graphics settings to get the FPS result that you want. And that's also really great to see. But of all the games that I ended up testing, one of the more demanding ones was Helldivers 2. Here you can see it running with the ultra graphics settings. There is no real upscaling built into the game. There is scaling options, but there's no real upscaling being applied to it, at least none of the standard upscalers that we know of. So this is just running at the native resolution, so full 1440p, the ultra graphics settings, and the result here isn't exactly great. The FPS average isn't even hitting 60, and the 1% lows are really more above 30 than anywhere near 60. But there's a lot of headroom to work with here. Instead of running at the maxed out graphics settings, you can bump things down just one tier, and that's already a big boost in your performance. This is a worst case scenario, and still it was a very playable result. Considering the type of game that this isn't exactly horrible performance. It's going to be more than playable, but I would recommend that you mess around with your graphics settings a little bit just to bring things down. Of airstrikes and a lot of enemies around, the FPS can really take a beating like this, so I do recommend that you bump things down just one tier. But even in a nightmare scenario like this, it's still doing a pretty great result, and this was one of the worst performing games that I took a look at. But there is another aspect of these Steam charts that I haven't mentioned yet, and that is really the rise of indie games. See, a game like R.E.P.O is kind of mogging everything on the Steam store right now, except for some of the titles that we've taken a look at here. It's an extremely popular title that the vast majority of people out there are playing, as opposed to something like The Finals that is far lower on the Steam charts. And this is a title that runs extremely well on hardware like this. Here is all of the graphics maxed out, which is a funny thing to say for this specific title because it is meant to look really bad. Or I really wouldn't say bad, it just is heavily stylized. But also as a result of that, it performs extremely well. To the point where I really recommend that you just cap your FPS. There's really no reason to have it unlimited. You don't need 1% lows of 230, and you don't need an FPS average above 400. And the reason that you would consider doing that is that it really brings down the amount of power that your system is utilizing. As you can see here, we pretty much cut the GPU power usage in half by just capping the FPS at 144 Hertz. That is getting the full capabilities of my display while also not really taxing my GPU all that much. So the system is running cooler, it's running quieter, and it's not heating up my room as much. And considering it's the middle of summer in Texas, that is a real godsend. Because with my main gaming computer that has a 6950 XT, when I'm gaming, it can bring up the temperature in my room to the point where I have to go full gamer mode and just be in no shirt, only boxers, hunched over on my computer, sweating like an animal, losing in Marvel Rivals. And why do that when I can just boot up a R.E.P.O, play with my friends? I promise I have friends, they just weren't around to play the game with me at the time. And just have this thing running so cool and so quiet. The entirety of this system right now is using less power than just the graphics card alone on my main gaming rig to play the exact same game. And of course, another indie title that has seen a massive rise is one that I particularly have really enjoyed playing, and that is Peak. But what's interesting about Peak is that I loaded into the game, and at first you load into the airport area, and I launched the game with DirectX 12 since that's what I normally play at, and while loading in, it seems like there was some issues happening here. A lot of graphical issues, to the point where I didn't even know the Scoutmaster was here in the airport with us. Seeing through the walls here, I can see that he's just standing there, menacingly. And I never would have found this out if it wasn't for the fact that I used DirectX 12 with the B580, and this to me was a huge surprise. This is the first title that I tried that gave me any issues with this graphics card, so the fact that it is one of the lightest titles out there is kind of hilarious. But thankfully there is a fix to this. Simply launch the game with Vulkan. As soon as I did that, everything was working perfectly fine here. Now the game for the most part does default to you using Vulkan. It's the top result when you first launch the game, but I was using DirectX 12 because that's what my friends and I use. We just used DirectX 12 because we ran into an issue where we couldn't really hear each other when we were trying to play the game. Some people's mics would get picked up, others people's wouldn't. And what we found was the solution was everybody just play on the same API, so we just chose DirectX 12. But if you're just using Vulkan, you're going to be perfectly fine, and I spent an unnecessarily long amount of time of trying to see if I could get to the Scoutmaster because I know he's behind these walls. He's just sitting there waiting, and I kind of wanted to know if there was an Easter egg associated with that. But outside of some initial launch stutters that would happen with, Vulkan just caching shaders, as I progressed up, there was really not any issues. The game was performing really, really well, as you would expect for an indie title like this. And I think that that's an important distinction for a graphics card like this. 2024 was the year where indie games almost overtook AAA titles in terms of the games that made the most money on Steam. That's a pretty significant development right there. And 2025 is proving to be the year that might actually end up seeing indie games completely overtake the AAA industry. And that's a pretty seismic shift in terms of what has been happening here. Of course, older titles are still going to continue to be in dominant positions. Counter-Strike has been around for so long that there are at this point multiple generations of Counter-Strike players. But in terms of newer titles, it does seem like indie games are starting to become the hit factor. And a lot of these titles seem to run on practically anything. Games like Peak, games like R.E.P.O, Lethal Company, these indie titles that are made by smaller devs that end up becoming these massive hits tend to be games that run on practically anything. So a graphics card like this that is more budget orientated suddenly becomes a pretty great option, especially considering that this is, again, at 1440p. The vast majority of people are on 1080p displays. That means you're going to get a better result than this. And I think that overall is showing a pretty major trend. People don't really care about graphics in games anymore. What people care about more is the experience that you get out of the game itself. Nobody cares how beautiful a game is if it's going to be some unfinished slop. Buying some high quality assets for your Unity game or your Unreal game is very easy to do, but putting together a good, fun, enjoyable experience that isn't just meant to be a money printer, well, that's a completely different scenario. And ironically enough, a game like Peak ends up being a money printer, not because it's a game that's interested in maximizing on how to squeeze you out of every single dollar that you have, but because it made a very fun, very playable experience that a lot of people enjoy. And that's pretty much all the things that I tested. And look, I understand this isn't a very comprehensive list of all the games out there, and there's a good chance that there might be some games out there that are still having issues with these drivers. But for the most popular games, it does seem to at least provide a level of performance where you can get away with playing practically everything. I mean, we were testing at 1440p here. But now the real question is, well, where does this land in the middle of 2025 going towards the end? I mean, we are already in August. Well, taking a look at Newegg, around the price point that you could find B580s right now seems to be around $260, sometimes going on sale for even lower than that. And at that price point, it might seem like an interesting deal, especially when you look at what's around it, things like the RTX 3060, which still seems to be pretty relevant today, mostly due to the fact that people just consider buying Nvidia over anything else most of the time anyway. And well, the only other competition that it has around the $200 to $300 price point is the RTX 9060 XT, but that's with only 8 gigabytes of RAM, and that's going to give you some problems in specific titles. But the RX 9060 XT does perform better in the titles that aren't going to be VRAM limited, and if you can get a 16 gigabyte version of that card, then you're going to see a pretty massive uplift in performance. Of course, that comes at an increased price point though. And I mean, the same applies to the RTX 5060 8 gigabyte version, which is around that $300 price point and will perform better in the titles that aren't limited by those 8 gigabytes, but in the ones that are, you're going to run into some pretty major issues. 8 gigabytes is pretty limiting, especially in a brand new card today. Of course, there are cards like the RX 7600, and that is the non-XT version, so that only has 8 gigabytes of RAM, and that's also more expensive at around $280 to $300. So at the price point that it's hovering at, the competition isn't exactly able to keep up too well. But if you are willing to spend an extra $100, that does bring you up into the territory of the RX 9060 XT with 16 gigabytes of RAM. But of course, there is also the new RTX 5050 that just hit the market, but at least in the performance testing that I've seen, it does come behind the B580 in performance while not exactly being any cheaper. So while the landscape has changed dramatically, where there are more cards on the market, the B580 isn't exactly in a terrible spot. I wouldn't really say that anybody that picks up the B580 today is getting that bad of a deal. Of course, you are still going to potentially run into some issues with the drivers, but considering the rocky launch that the 5000 series from Nvidia has had with their drivers, it's not exactly a new phenomenon here. That said, as we could probably expect, the vast majority of people are going to buy Nvidia anyway. Even more expensive cards. In fact, there's a likelihood that you're going to see people pick up something like the RTX 3060 12 gigabyte over any AMD or Intel graphics card. In fact, if we look at the best-selling graphics cards right now, in the $200 to $300 price range on Newegg, we are looking at the RTX 3060 12 gigabyte from MSI. Then we have the ASRock RX 6600 for $220, and then we finally get to the first B580 graphics card, and that is an Onyx Odyssey at $260. And well, right behind that is the RTX 5060 8 gigabyte that sells for $300. But at least in terms of where it lands on the market, it isn't exactly terrible. Again, if you look at comparison videos of the B580 and things like the RX 9060 XT 16 gigabyte or the higher VRAM versions of Nvidia graphics cards, yeah, it does fall behind, but the price point is pretty dramatic. Going from $260 to something that is $380 to $400 is a pretty massive jump. So where it stands right now in the market it's a rather decent deal, especially if you're looking to step away from Nvidia or AMD for whatever reason. Now, I won't fault anybody for going with Nvidia because that seems to be the only option that a lot of people see in their minds. And at this point, I'm pretty much past the point of even wanting to try to get across to people that there are better options out there. If people want to spend their money on things that aren't as good a value, by all means. But if you're a smarter shopper out there, I would really consider something like the B580. It's kind of a shame where things are right now, but if you're not really willing to look in the used market, and I would really recommend that you just look used first before you consider buying a new graphics card. The B580 at the price point that it sits at today is not a bad offer at all. It has a nice balance of VRAM and performance, and considering that we tested at 1440p here and it did great in all of the tests, it's really hard to call it a bad deal. The real question is, what is going to be the long-term support of a graphics card like this? Is Intel going to end up axing their GPU division? It should be noted that as of right now, these graphics cards aren't even manufactured in Intel's own factories. These are made by TSMC. In fact, it's TSMC's 5nm node. So it's not even the bleeding edge from TSMC, but it's still competitive in the category that it's competing at, though I'm sure it's not the category that Intel would like it to be competing in. So even if Intel drops out of the foundry business and they just end up becoming what Nvidia and AMD have been for a very long time now, where they're just customers of TSMC, they're still going to be able to continue to produce graphics cards the problem now becomes, what is the price point the graphics cards are going to be at if TSMC has a complete monopoly on chip manufacturing? Well, that's a topic for another discussion, but as of right now, I do think that the B580 is a relatively good deal. And if you're on the market for a GPU, you really should consider it, especially if you're shopping at this price point. And I know it's one of the most popular price points out there, but at least based off of the most recent Steam hardware survey, it does seem like gamers are still choosing Nvidia over anything else, even if it's a bad configuration, or they're willing to spend more money just to stay with Nvidia. And while I do think that that doesn't bode well for the future of PC hardware in general, as I said, I can only do so much to try to convince people to move away from Nvidia. And I know that's going to fall on deaf ears, but for the people out there that do consider an Intel GPU, just know that at least for the most popular games out there, you're going to be able to have a good experience at a resolution like 1440p, which I do recommend most people use if they want to step up from 1080p. 4K is too big of a jump and it's not worth it, but 1440p is the sweet spot. But anyways, I'll catch you guys in the next one.